Hi, and welcome to another video by The Practical Disciple. I'm John Arnold, and today I'm going to walk you through a timeline. And a timeline can be a particularly helpful tool when you're going over sections of Scripture that could be confusing because you have different books covering the same period of time. So, for example, this timeline roughly is going to cover the books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and a little bit of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's going to capture that section of history. And there are some other prophets that would overlap it with this, but we're going to really stay focused mostly on those historic books. And I'm just giving this to you so you have sort of an overview, a bird's eye view of the big picture of the story. And I think that will help you retain it better and understand the events that unfold in it. So let's get started, and we're gonna run from 1100 BC to about 400 BC. And 1100 BC is a very important time in the life of Israel because that marks when Samuel was ruling over Israel as the very last judge that Israel will have. And I don't know if you recall this, but Israel wanted to be like other nations. And so they asked God to give them a king, and he really was displeased by that, did not want to do that. Basically said, I'll give you a king, but you're going to regret it. So they get a king, and their first king is Saul. And Saul has a reign in which he is constantly fighting, particularly against the Philistines, to truly lay claim to the land. And eventually you'll remember David fought Goliath in an epic battle, which was kind of maybe the beginning of a turn of the tide, if you will, against the Philistines in that area. And David is the one who, over time, is able to conquer the Philistines and some other tribes. He is able to establish Jerusalem in 970 BC as a capital for Israel, which is huge in creating a kind of an epicenter for their identity as a people. So they claim Jerusalem. Jerusalem becomes the capital for the Israelites, and the first temple is built. And now, if you don't remember this, David really wanted to build a temple for God so that God sort of had a permanent home, if you will, after having led them through the wilderness and the conquest of the promised land. But God says, you're not going to get to do that. Your son will build the temple. You're a man of war. You have too much blood on your hands, is essentially what God says. And David does all kinds of preparation in terms of recruiting craftsmen and procuring materials, but he doesn't actually get to build the temple. And Solomon, in around 930 BC, he constructs the first temple. Epic moment for the people of Israel, because now they truly have a home, if you will, for their people and their God. At least symbolically, that sort of rooted that in their mindsets. So we have, at the death of Solomon, a huge shift that occurs for Israel. Under David, there was a single monarchy, meaning all the tribes of the north and the south were by and large unified under David. When Solomon dies, there is a split, and this is around 930, 931 BC. There's a split, and this blue timeline at the top is kind of representing a couple core events that happen in the north, and we'll talk about the south down here. Some of these things relate to the north, but roughly think of this as north and south timelines. There's a division in the kingdom where the northern tribes, they pull away, they want to be self-governed. And the northern kingdom oftentimes does not follow in the footsteps of David, meaning they're not faithful to God. They break covenant with God by embracing cultic practices of northern tribes, of the Canaanites and the peoples of those regions. And they set up altars to false gods and Assyrian poles and a number of other totems and tributes where they began to honor these false gods, and that is almost normative for the northern kingdom. In the southern kingdom, they are not always faithful to the covenant of David, but we do have the covenant David had with God. But they do have a continuous dynasty, meaning all of the kings who sit on the throne in the southern kingdom are kings who are out of David's family line. Whereas in the northern kingdom, what you have are you have a continuous succession of kings, but they are from differing dynasties, meaning one family will have a succession of 4 or 5 kings, and then that family will die out, or there'll be a political coup of some sort, and another family will take over. And they'll continue to have kings, but those kings are not always faithful to God. So, split is a huge deal for the north and the south. Northern tribes referred to as Israel, southern tribes being referred to as Judah. Well, time passed on. I'm going to kind of fast forward to a couple other major events because I don't want this video to be too terribly long. It's just a bird's eye view. In 722, the Assyrians, who were kind of northeast, if this were a map of Israel, the Assyrians and the Babylonians were up to the northeast. They come in and they take over the northern kingdom and deport those folks. So in 722, people in the north are exiled out of, they're exiled off into captivity by the Assyrians. Time marches on. The Assyrian Empire eventually comes to an end because the Babylonian Empire arises. And when the Babylonian Empire rises and the Assyrians fall in roughly 612 BC, then Judah becomes exiled. The southern kingdom becomes exiled. And that's in about 3 different distinct waves. If you recall the story of Daniel, or when you get to that and you read the story of Daniel, that was one of the early deportations of people. They started with kind of the brightest and the best, the royalty, the children of the royalty, and they took those folks and they displaced them into Babylonia and tried to make them into good Babylonian citizens, if you will. And over time, they continued to exile folks until in the third and really final wave of deportation, they actually enter in Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and at that point, that's pretty much the annihilation of the southern kingdom as a continuous kingdom. At that point, everybody gets deported, other than essentially the poor and the keepers of the land are left behind in the southern kingdom's regions around Jerusalem. So those are huge events. Now, again, time marches on. The Babylonian Empire eventually comes to an end, and the Persian Empire arises. And there is a man in 538 named Cyrus, who is a Persian ruler. And Cyrus makes a decree and says, listen, I'm going to allow all of you deported Israelites, these people from Judah and from Israel, from the north and the south kingdom, I'm going to allow you to go back to your homes. And he lets them go back, and the southern kingdom folks who go back to Jerusalem, they begin to rebuild the temple because they're given permission, 515, to rebuild the temple. Actually, they're given permission earlier than that. They complete the temple in 515 BC. There's a funny little thing that goes on. Actually, it wasn't so funny, it was a big deal. Some of the folks from the northern kingdom who had, over time, gotten completely intermingled with the people of the northern tribes, they essentially evolve into what we refer to know as the Samaritans. And the Samaritans and these folks who are in the north hear about the temple being rebuilt, and they offer to help. And their help is rejected. And they're displeased by this, so they actually turn on them, and they do things and try to disrupt the building of the temple. And this is where the roots of the prejudice that you see in the New Testament between the Hebrews and the Samaritans comes from. It goes back to this history where these folks who were reestablishing the temple and the folks who had followed the Davidic line, if you will, of rulers, they rejected the help of those in the north and kind of stood in judgment over them, did not see them as part of Israel because they had become intermingled with people of the north and with the Babylonian, well, the Assyrian and Babylonian peoples. And so they were kind of no longer pure, if you will, and a part of Israel. Huge bone of contention between those peoples. Again, time presses on, and we get to 458, 445 BC, and the temple has been rebuilt for some time, but the walls of Jerusalem are still in ruins. So Ezra begins to work on building the walls. Nehemiah takes part in that, and there is a reestablishment of Jerusalem fully, to where it's not just the temple, but the city as a walled city is now reestablished. And at that point, or not too long after that, 380 BC, we find that the Samaritans start their own temple, and they build a temple on Mount Gerizim and Gerizim, and that really is to me, as I read it, the kind of final nail in the coffin, if you will, between the relationship between the Samaritans and the Hebrew people. So there you have the rough sweep of history. I think the really important events along this spectrum are taking a king as a people so they can be like other nations, because it is a rejection of God. The split of the two kingdoms and the growing antagonism between those two peoples. The Assyrian deportation of the northern tribes, eventually the Babylonian deportation of the southern tribes, and the restoration under the Persian Empire of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem, and then eventually the establishment of a second temple that's kind of a competing temple, if you will. So I hope that helps you as you read along. I've got another video that I want you to look at, much briefer, that just shows how the books of Samuel, Chronicles, and Kings line up along this timeline. So hope that helps, and I will see you in the next video. Blessings on your reading.